Let's get over now to Mr. Babatunde Ajibade, Senior Advocate of Nigeria. He joins us via Skype this morning. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us today on the program. There's been a lot of talk about this infectious diseases bill, referencing the National Quarantine Act and different perspectives, really. But you've gone through some of this. What strikes you looking at the bill?
Thank you for inviting me to speak on this. What strikes me is that this bill, I think, is a bit too draconian. I think the bill takes away and strikes at the root of a significant number of our civil liberties. And it's a bill that I think has to be considered with great caution. I think the bill also vests too much power in the hands of the Director General of the control of diseases agency. I mean, the current Director General is, from all I've seen of him, appears to be a very decent gentleman. But then we're not guaranteed that we will always have a decent gentleman in that office. And when you enact laws, you have to anticipate that those laws will not be just for the moment. I think it's a bill that has to be considered with significant caution.
When you say it's too draconian, because there are different schools of thought. Some think, wait a minute, do we take away most of portions of this bill? Do we stop the bill entirely? Do we redraft the entire bill? Or is it just some portions that are draconian, if I could use your words there, such that if we revisit some of those clauses, then maybe the bill may be good to go?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we should throw the entire bill out. We're facing unprecedented circumstances at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I guess my view would be that we should understand what the rationale is for the bill and then calibrate the necessity for some of what the bill purports to put in place. I mean, the bill attacks your right to property, it attacks your liberty, it attacks your right to movement, and all at the say-so of the DG. I think that the bill needs to, even if it's going to pass, there have to be introduced a significant amount of checks and balances so that you don't have a situation in which one person uses the powers vested in him or her by this bill to arbitrarily affect the rights of citizens. So, I mean, I think it's just a case of, the cure being worse than the ailment. Yes, there's a problem. Yes, we're all concerned about it, but I think this bill is actually going much too far. And if it must pass at all, it should be significantly modified.
I know you always talk about the profession, the intendment of this, and perhaps what's the thinking of the drafters. What do you think was the intention of the drafters concerning this bill when you look at it holistically from your perspective?
Well, you touched on an important point there, and I'm going out on a limb here, but I think, there's so much in the social media space and in society world over at the moment, all sorts of conspiracy theories, which I think make, even though, one must try to be objective at all times, but we're in extraordinary times, it's impossible to ignore all this. And that is more reason why I think, given all what is swirling around, I think a bill with such extensive repercussions and implications as this should be given careful consideration. I, for example, would want to know, what is the source of this bill? Did it originate from us here in Nigeria? Did it originate from the National Assembly? Was it sent to us from abroad? If it was sent from abroad, who sent it? What is the motivation? So there's a lot involved in this, and that is why I share the concerns of those who say, even if this bill must pass, I think we need to investigate the circumstances a lot more carefully, and it's not something that should be rushed.
There are some of those conspiracy theories that you mentioned when a number of people are saying the right of the NCDC Director General or anyone at that to impose vaccination on people and all of that. And some of them are even alluding, just as you mentioned on social media and other platforms, to the fact that this could be one of those plans to digitize, to put some digital things into people. So on the one hand is the fact that the members of the House of Representatives, some of them are of the opinion that, look, this thing, we haven't even begun to consider it the way it ought to be. On the other hand, there are those who say the fact that it went through the first and the second reading so expeditiously at just one session and almost got through with the third reading without the normal procedures, just as you have said. Do you think the mindset of those who have those questions, do you think it is justified, those who are afraid of these conspiracy theories? Do you think their concerns are justified?
Yes, I do. In a nutshell, I do. As I said, we have a crisis on our hands, and a crisis can lead to knee-jerk reactions, and knee-jerk reactions can have positive but also sometimes negative results. I think that the concerns that have been expressed, both conspiracy theories and both those that have been expressed about what appears to be the undue haste to pass this bill into law, and as I said, concerns about what is the source of this bill. Did it originate from us? If it didn't originate from us, what is the motivation for those who might be pushing for its enactment into law? I think these are all legitimate concerns, and I think that the National Assembly, being the body we have elected to represent our interests, should proceed with caution and make sure that they do represent our interests and that they don't yield the protections that the law provides to citizens. They don't yield it up to forces that might be unseen without due consideration. I mean, all these rights and liberties are, of course, subject to limitations that are imposed by law, and this would be such a law. But if you're going to take away these rights and liberties, I mean, the bill allows the NCDC Director General to confiscate your property. It allows him to apprehend you. Allows him to apprehend members of your family. I mean, these are extensive powers to be granted to an individual, and I don't think that is something that should be dealt with such haste.
Well, we'll consider some of those clauses one after the other in a little bit, but if you were to recommend, one of the crucial things in the legislative process is that of a public hearing. Given the challenges that we have now, this pandemic and all this physical distancing stuff, how do you recommend, or how do you think the House of Representatives should go about that if, in your opinion, this law should still have its time?
Well, I think that there are other ways in which you can go about legislation that might not necessarily necessitate a full public hearing. There are several bodies that represent segments of society. The Nigerian Bar Association is one. The Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria is another that I can think of immediately that would be representative of a large proportion of the citizenry. So the Nigerian Bar Association would be able to look at this from a legal perspective and advise on what we as lawyers think about the necessity for some of the provisions in this bill. And then the Nigerian Medical and Dental Council or the Nigerian Medical Association would also be able to weigh in from a medical perspective. I mean, like I said, one of my greatest concerns reading through the bill, and I only just read through it yesterday night, is that it vests too much power, in my view, in the Director General of the NCDC. And I think that there should be some more. The bill should at least contain significant checks and balances on the exercise of that power. So it's not just the Director General feels that this place should be locked down or this person should be put in detention because he's suspected to have an infectious disease. And it's done just like that without anybody having a say as to the propriety of that decision. So I think that there's I think those are the portions and the aspects of the bill that I think should be subjected to scrutiny. And I think that even without a public hearing, that scrutiny can take place if the bill is sent to relevant segments of society.
But isn't that going to defeat part of the purpose where they spoke about us attending to some of these things? Because at some point, they did talk about the COVID-19 regulations, which the president did sign, in order to give it that proper legal framework. So if they send it to all of those other bodies and agencies, do you see them achieving that purpose and getting the legal framework for COVID-19 regulations in good time?
Well, my understanding is that the COVID-19 regulations were passed under extant legislation, the Quarantine Act. I don't think, except because legislation doesn't in democratic setting have retrospective or retroactive effect. So I don't think this bill is being proposed to authorize what has already been done. What has already been done, I understand, is covered by extant law. So this bill it can only be looking forward. And to the extent that it's looking forward, I still maintain that we should move forward. We should make haste slowly and make sure that we don't create more problems than we're trying to solve.
But if you say moving forward, if assuming this bill goes through all the processes and everyone agrees with it and then it's passed, it takes effect almost immediately, and that will affect the current scenario we have facing COVID-19. Is that how it's supposed to play out?
Yes, I guess that's how it's supposed to play out, because my understanding of the current situation is that this pandemic is not going to disappear very quickly. It's going to be with us for a while, and the aftermath of it, even when the pandemic goes, the aftermath of it is going to be with us for a lot longer. To the extent that this bill is designed to deal with the issues arising from this pandemic, I don't think that is necessarily appropriate. I think that this bill should be looking at, we pray that we don't have another pandemic anytime soon. I mean, the last one of this scale was in 1918, I'm told, long before any of us was born. But we have to start planning ahead. So I think the bill should actually be looking at, God forbid, if this happens again, we should be in a better position to respond. But I don't think that it should be something that's going to be used immediately.
Okay.
And that is why I said there's...
Yeah, Mr. Ajibade, my apologies. We'll go to break, but we'll come back in 4 minutes so that we can take a look at some of the clauses, unless I hazard ideas. Please join us again. All right, welcome back, and let's see if we can take a look at some of the provisions of this bill. Now, different groups have raised different views, objections, concerns about some of the clauses. Let's attempt to just take a look at some of them and see some of the issues that they do have. Okay, well, we might as well go with 15, even though there are some others which they raised. But, Mr. Ajibade, if you could talk about this one. Now, concerning isolation areas, where it says, as we see there, 15.1, the minister may, for the purpose of preventing the spread or possible outbreak of an infectious disease by notification in the Gazette, declare any premises to be an isolation area. And it goes on to say, a notification under subsection 1 shall be effective until the expiration of such period as may be specified in the notification, or until it is revoked by the minister, whichever occurs first. And the subsections exist, they go on. But for those proponents of this section, they think that, for instance, they know that some states are using private property for isolation areas. They've seen cases where people are not volunteering information about their medical history, concealing it, and then endangering other people's lives. For such people, do they have a point if they think there's nothing wrong with this clause?
I think that, we need to take each clause within context. As I said, my concern is the arbitrariness of the power that is vested, be it in the minister or the director general. And I think in society, they say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that we just need to ensure that checks and balances are put there to ensure that the rights of citizens are protected. So if the minister or the director general feels the need to exercise these powers, I would love to see a situation in which the exercise of those powers are subjected to scrutiny before they take effect. And scrutiny, of course, means the judicial process. That is the best way to protect citizens against the exercise of power. So I would have thought that the minister ought to, before making such draconian orders, perhaps obtain a court order to that effect, saying that this is the evidence showing that this person or these persons have are concealing people who are infected, and their area should be cordoned off or declared an isolation area. I just feel discomfort with these powers being exercised by individuals and the risk of arbitrariness.
Well, seeing that, I mean, looking at this bill, in fact, the way it progressed, speed was one major, characteristic of this. And over time, we've heard, people accusing governments of not moving fast enough in the United States, even here in Nigeria and across other countries. So seeing that, it will seem as though this bill, maybe when it becomes an act, seeks to give, response a bit, some more speed, maybe. How do we now balance it? If you say that there needs to be some checks and balances in place, how do we achieve speed at the same time?
Well, I think the balance that needs to be struck, governance was never going to be easy. The balance that needs to be struck is between achieving your objectives and yet protecting the rights of citizens against abuse. My view, the concerns about the inadequacy of the response are not just in Nigeria, but in several parts of the world. I don't think it's a function of the existence or non-existence of laws such as this. I think that was more because of the refusal or inability of the authorities in certain places to take this matter as serious as it ought to have been taken. I don't think that we needed legislation such as this to have reacted quicker. And I think part of the challenges we've seen is that even when we've reacted, there hasn't been, in my view, sufficient coordination. I just don't think that this bill is the solution to that aspect of the problem.
What I'm trying to say is now, over the course of, going through this bill, we've seen that one thing it gives to maybe the minister, the DG, or the president is the ability to make these decisions fast, and then maybe at a later date they might review them if this gives them the opportunity. So what I'm trying to say is, in the light of that, don't you think that it still makes sense to allow for, some level of speed? So maybe the part that can be put in later or even during this consideration is to always have maybe a check and balance in place maybe afterwards?
There's that possibility, but, like I said, this bill contains provisions that may be necessary or that may be reasonable. It also contains provisions that are not. The haste and the concern that is being expressed is that a lot of things are being lumped together. So if there are certain instances in which speed is of the essence, those should be isolated. And the powers that are vested in the bill, that are vested in individuals or agencies by the bill, are okay where those are concerned. But I don't think there's been sufficient effort in this bill to isolate one from the other. I mean, for example, we're talking about a bill that says that, you can be compelled to be vaccinated. I don't know that we've even reached, there's no vaccine yet. So why are we already talking about a bill that's going to, or provisions that are going to compel people to accept vaccination when the vaccine is not even yet in place? I think that, we cannot just take this hook, line, and sinker because there is an emergency. We're all concerned about the emergency, but we need to ensure that this is not used as an opportunity to deprive us of our civil liberties and of our choice.
But one of the things that invoked this outrage, if we can use that word, over this bill, this barrage of concerns that a number of people have raised, is that it seems to overrule human rights. I don't know if there is any section of this bill that you have noticed that protects the human rights of the people for whom, as you said, this bill is intended. For instance, if someone feels that, look, my right has been stepped upon as a result of this bill, is there any part of this bill that anyone who feels insulted by this bill could go to court to seek redress?
Yes, there is a provision. See if I can locate it quickly. But there's a provision that, at least in terms of infringement of your right to property, where your property has been confiscated, that says that within 3 days you can approach a magistrate court to seek redress. I'll see if I can find it. But that is. I guess that is acceptable to the extent that it gives you a right to approach the court after the event. I would prefer, subject to further scrutiny of the bill and of its of what it intends to achieve, I would prefer a situation where, absent an emergency, it is not after the event. It's not after your property has been confiscated and your rights have been infringed that you now seek redress in court. I would prefer a situation in which, before that right or before that authority is exercised, the judiciary actually has an opportunity to review the basis on which the authorities seek to exercise that power, so that you're not doing what we call medicine after death. Because sometimes.
Yeah, but just one moment. Don't you think that, because we're talking about an infectious disease here, so it's good? Do you think, on the one hand, do you think that's provision is enough balance? And then if the person has to go to court before the action can be taken, don't you see that as also injurious to public health? I mean, if the disease spreads even before the judgment of the magistrate.
That might be right, and that is why I say we need to strike a balance. We're in a world where power can be exercised for a variety of reasons. And I said this right at the beginning. I said, from all I've seen of the current Director General of the NCDC, he appears to be a very decent human being. So I'm not concerned about current leadership. But when you pass laws and you give people powers, you need to anticipate that others might misuse those powers. So it is in that context that I say that, to the extent that it is possible, like I said, I only reviewed this bill cursorily yesterday night, but it contains sufficient provisions to alarm me, and I think that there are provisions that would alarm citizens, and that checks and balances should be put in place. Where there is a need, where there is urgency, yes, some powers can be exercised for the protection of the citizens, and maybe after the event is when the citizens can establish that those powers were misused. But in the absence of that urgency, I would rather that the exercise of those powers was scrutinized even before implementation. And there's something in law, it happens already. Our laws are replete with provisions where before you can do something, you need to obtain an order ex parte. I'm not talking about a hearing or a full hearing to determine the propriety of exercise of such powers. It will be an ex parte application just to make sure that somebody else, an independent party, has a look at what you're planning to do and is satisfied that there's justification for it. And so, like I said, I'm not talking even just about COVID-19. I'm looking at the implication of vesting these powers in an individual without appropriate checks and balances in the circumstances in which it will be exercised.
Okay, as we wind down on this conversation, I'd like to take you up on something else. I see that something new happened here in Lagos. The first court session that happened via video conferencing happened yesterday. And, this is opening up a new vista for, the legal profession, the judiciary here in the country. So saying that this is the way forward, do you see that we're prepared for this, especially in that sector. How well prepared are we for this? And maybe will this speed up the process?
Yes, it will definitely speed up the process. You know, again, it's a cliche, but they say we should never waste a good crisis. What we're seeing now with COVID-19 and the restrictions on movement is hopefully that we're going to be able to leapfrog and close a lot of gaps that exist in our administration of justice. So, you know, it's going to require a significant amount of investment in infrastructure for the courts. It's going to require a significant amount of investment in training to bring the personnel in the judiciary and in the legal profession, those of us that are not yet as tech savvy as we ought to be. We're all going to have to catch up very quickly. But I think quite clearly that with what is happening now, we're not going to go back to business as usual. Virtual hearings are going to become a reality. They were part of our rules before now, but there was a lot of resistance because we're naturally resistant to change. Some of our courts had provisions for virtual hearings already anyway, but they weren't compulsory. It was optional. I think going forward that we're going to see a lot more of that, and I think we'll be better off for it.
Interesting. I think it will also be very interesting to see how the National Assembly hold public hearing in these times and adopting this process. We'll see what happens at the end of the day. But we do sincerely thank you, Mr. Babatunde Ajibade, SAN, for talking to us today.
Thank you.